Michel, that there is some similarity, some meaningful similarity here between his interpretation of quantum mechanics and the Buddhist philosophical tradition? This seems like a very big and bold claim.
Yeah.
This reminds me, some time back, I think at least maybe 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, in Delhi, one occasion, one Indian nuclear physicist, Rajaram or something.
Rajaram.
Ah.
Rajaram.
Oh. That, his nickname, usually people call India's Sakharov, because you see, he was one of the scientists who built India's nuclear weapon. So, she told me, quantum physics in the world, in modern world, this is something new, very new theory. He found the essence of that concept, he found already in Nagarjuna's text, some writing. So that's 2,000 years ago. That's the suchness shares on the Tishini. So the in Buddhism, and particularly the Nalanda tradition, there are 4 schools of thought. So except the Madhyamaka, even within Madhyamaka, there are different sort of concepts. So basically, those are the school of thought, which essentially believe something
intrinsic existence.
Intrinsic existence. So they talk about the 유증은에 직접 주위에 가서 그게 랑섬치 랑겨치 주위에 시사 제인데 아니 잡아서 제인데 녀도 사오시지 걔도 뭔가 태어나지.
So within the history of Buddhist thought, there were 4 main primary classical Buddhist schools of thought, and except for one of the branches of the Madhyamaka school, middle way school, all the other Buddhist schools' view of the world, particularly the physical world, was really grounded upon some kind of quest for the ultimate
both physical world
and the mental world. Sort of driven by this quest for seeking the ultimate constitutive elementary blocks, which are somehow have an intrinsic existence, an essence by virtue of which they exist. So once you go through that line of inquiry, then eventually you run into all sorts of problems.
Yeah.
So then the 4th Madhyamaka philosophy, so without investigate these things which actually is the effect, these are reality. Okay, it exists. But if we investigate what is the reality of that, then we can't find. So then nothingness. Right. Oh. So the appearance due to many other factors. If we investigate the object itself, you can't find. The very nature of the existence of these things are due to other factors, not by itself. So our sort of investigation is focusing on the particular sort of the subject. Right? So since its very existence is due to other factors, not itself, so we can't find.
That's right.
That does not mean non-existence.
Nothing exists.
Nothing
exists.
Yes, exactly.
It is fact. It is work.
Yes.
So then, conclusion kareta, ono yodana karesana, the mere designation.
So then the question is, in what sense can we say they exist? What is the mode of their existence? Then we can only understand in some relational terms or by mere designation.
That's right.
다양 르 딱서로 열어서 말다세요.
No.
르 딱서로 열어서 열말이세요.
And then another question could be raised. In that case, whatever mind constructs, does that mean it exists?
Any mental objection has a mental
Mental object.
mental projection.
Not really.
Does it exist? No.
Then the answer is, of course, no.
타녀의 타녀도 자신 주바. 대로 타녀의 사마시지 민우도 그거다.
So it's not only should it be something that is kind of, affirmed by a kind of a consensual convention, but also that the reference of that convention should not be something that can be contradicted by another valid convention.
Right.
So very similar. The
Very
scientific
similar.
sort of research. One scientist to find something, you will not sort of decide.
Right.
But you see, another sort of repeat
Confirmation,
tested that, and also some other. They all found similar. Then decide that's true. So that are tiny bit samashan.
So this is what is meant by the second criteria, that it should not be violated or contradicted by another valid cognition.
Right.
That's right.
그래서 이거는 내가 지금 전담주의가 지금 얘기하면 민우바 사실 안에서도 가가.
And then, of course, in the Buddhist text, there is a third criterion added to this, which is that it should not also be negated by an inquiry that searches after the ultimate mode of existence as well. But that, of course, takes us into a Buddhist domain,
I see.
Buddhist philosophical domain.
Yes.
부디스 나로리아 야 타니베 층가시 딱든자니 니베 루스체니 샤베 인두자네 딱고 탄답지르게 있는 거.
So, for example, within the Buddhist world, from the Madhyamaka point of view, since many of the postulates by other schools are essentially, arrived at as a result of a form of inquiry that was actually seeking for their ultimate mode of existence.
So seems, of course, in detail there are still differences, but broadly, I think the Buddhist Madhyamaka philosophy and the quantum physics we can shake hands. Isn't it? What do you think? Do you think?
I think so. Let's shake hands.
Not that way.
No.
So in any way, these things are really wonderful. I really feel human intelligence is such sort of ability to think, to investigate. So these thinkers, really great,
Thank you very
great.
much.
I think we can say that a human being.
So we can see in these examples of the great thoughts and ideas presented the fruits of the human thinking, great thought thinking.
Then meantime, we must have sort of feeling, these are also human beings, nothing special. So we also have the ability, whether we properly utilize this ability. If we consider these are something Buddhists say, manifestation of a Buddha,
Yes.
we are not like that. Then, so
So the point His Holiness is making is that, regardless of how much we might admire these great thinkers, we should never lose the sight that we too are human beings who have the same potential.
Yes.
Otherwise, there is a danger of excluding ourselves from that ability. Because sometimes, that may seem like a humility, but also, actually, sometimes it could be just a cop-out.
Right.
Yes.
Well, Your Holiness, you suggested that maybe in your retirement you would like to become a scientist with Richie perhaps in his lab, but there's also the possibility of physics.
We can start a bidding war.
But Holiness, you can also become a philosopher
Yes,
in
yes,
my team.
그냥 quantum physics 타는체 이나도 particle 보시셔야다. particle 타는체는 내가 로드 많이 충으로 돈다. 이런 게
So, I mean, maybe His Holiness will accept this invitation on the condition that you spoke about how, as a function of special relativity, the time can collapse, and then particles can, collapse and so on.
Yes.
So maybe you could decrease His Holiness's age, and you'll be able to.
That I will work.
To travel very fast,
Yes,
is that
I
right?
think Richie and I can both work on that. We'll come back next year.
It is an interesting feature of science internationally, Your Holiness, that it is, in principle, open to everyone to do. And many, I think my colleagues will agree, many people who become distinguished in science do not come from particular scientific backgrounds.
That's right, that's
They
right.
do not have parents who were scientists for many generations. They got interested, perhaps as children, as you indeed did, and just followed their dream and ended up with a Nobel Prize in some cases. So I hope this is that people understand this, the people who are listening to this meeting, and there are many in another building, that there is an opportunity here, in principle, for them if they really want to do this, because science is open, it is not closed.
True, absolutely. Absolutely.
So I wonder, with that, whether we should move to our third talk.
That's right, that's right. Next. I would like to, I prefer you remain here.
Thank you. You're very gracious,
You can
Jimpa.
I really enjoy these talks and also every occasion learning new things.
Sure.
Now, big question whether these new knowledge remain here, how long, that I don't know.
This helps slow down aging.
Oh,
It helps to slow down aging.
Mike.
right, that's good.
This we know.
Yes, I think
how
it's
do I
quite
get
true.
to
You
my-
see,
Just
brain
have to,
remain very
close
active,
this.
always thinking.
Exit show.
That also, I
Read from
think,
this,
something like
and then you should be
refreshment
able to find yours.
or genes of the brain, I think.
Can you see yours? Oh, sorry. Okay.
Your Holiness, the task I have this afternoon is to make a short presentation, partly to draw parallels in the Buddhist thought to the two presentations, wonderful presentations we have heard from our scientific colleagues, Arthur and philosopher of science, Michel. What I would like to do is, of course, I cannot do justice to the more than 2,500 years of history of very serious Buddhist thinking in this domain. But at the same time, I thought I could give a little bit of glimpse of the kind of questions the Buddhist thinkers were, struggling with, and the kind of the amount of thought Buddhist thinkers have given to this quite early, from a very, very early stage. Before I begin, one of the things that I wanted to point out is that listening to both Michel and Arthur to your presentation of quantum mechanics as well as special theory of relativity and the challenges posed by the kind of the new physics. In fact, the challenges it poses to our very conception of what constitutes matter, our very conception of what is a matter and what is not a matter, which is so dominated by our everyday language of objects, things, and properties and attributes, and the kind of the paradoxes it leads to, as His Holiness very, kind of pointedly, shared with us. And this is something that has been very acutely felt in the Buddhist world as well. Among the Buddhist classical thinkers, there were four main schools which came to be categorized. And except for the Madhyamaka school, which is the middle way school, most of the other Buddhist schools really felt the need to, in order to have a coherent worldview, a theory of both matter and the mind, there needs to be a kind of a reductionist approach made to really reduce from the macroscopic level of everyday experience to tease it out, divide it up, to look at its constitutive elements, go down another level, tease them out, unpack it, go down another level, unpack it, tease it out, so that ultimately you can get to a kind of a starting point. It's a bit like what Descartes was trying to do. It's a foundationalist. And then these, but again, the Madhyamakas pointed out, that kind of project is actually quite unhelpful. So you can see that the tensions that we are witnessing in the world of modern physics is a tension that has been felt in the Buddhist world quite early. So what I will do is, I will give a very, very brief background for the benefit of scientists and scholars here, those who are unfamiliar with the history of Buddhist thinking. Much of these theory of matter and consciousness really begin to emerge, the systematic theory, in the early kind of Abhidhamma texts. And here, of course, the dating, there is some dispute among the modern scholars. But the earliest one that we know is Abhidhamma Hridaya, which is really attributed to somewhere around 1st century before the Common Era. Now, and this is the text where we begin to really see the explicit usage of the term dul, atom and particles. So as I said before, it's a reductionist approach. It's ultimately is a search for ultimate constituents of reality, from the gross level going down to smaller and smaller and smaller at different levels of reality. It ended up creating a pluralistic taxonomy of real entities. It's known as Dharma theory in the Buddhist studies jargon. And it ended up taking an atomistic theory of matter. So, and then the constitutive elements of these are, these are kind of the simple indivisibles, partless particles. And they ended up with a list of 8. 4 great elements and 4 derivative elements. Now, the derivative elements includes some of the properties which in Western thought would be regarded as secondary properties on Galileo's list. Sound is not there. Touch and order and so forth. Sound was excluded because sound was really thought to have no ability to propagate its continuum, because it rides on wave, and wave, does not continue. Wave is just one pushes the other, and sound therefore cannot propagate in a kind of a continued fashion. Then the list of the elementary particles, they made a distinction between, what is called Zedul Tarab. So these are really the ultimate constitutive elements, and which, for want of a better word, I've translated as elementary particles. This is the smallest unit. And then atom is really thought to be a composite of those smallest units, at least 8 of these. And then molecule is kind of a 7 of these composite atoms. So that was the kind of the unit that they built up. And then there was a very sophisticated, complex list of how the aggregation takes place, how it gets grosser and grosser and grosser. It's a very, very complex explanation. And the main point is that the elementary particles are ultimate indivisible. So this is really the final end. So you cannot go beyond. And now, then the question is, when within this atom there are 8 of these elementary particles, then the question was, how are they relating to each other? They were thought to be not touching each other, but then the question is, how is it they don't disintegrate? It's held by air. So there was, that was the, in very, very crude terms, summary of the early Buddhist Abhidhamma theory of atom. We could see a more sophisticated take on this, called what we might call a Sautrantika revision. Sautrantika is another school. They maintained the reductionist approach, but they rejected the plurality of entities. They wanted a much cleaner efficient system. So they defined reality or ngopo in terms of causal efficacy. And they came up with a simpler taxonomy. So basically 3 classes of phenomena: matter, mental, and their attributes. And then they came up with this idea of degrees of reality. So they made the distinction between substantial reality versus real in name and concept only, so which are constructs. So substantial realities are entities whose identity, in order to conceptualize, does not require the conceptualization of something else. So whereas those that are real in name and concept only, like person, the notion of a person is the second category, because notion of a person, in order to have it, it presupposes a notion of mind and some bases which are not person. Then they also maintained they retained these ultimate irreducible elements: indivisible particles, partless particles, and indivisible time. So with relation to matter, the way in which it was divided up was according to the indivisible atomic process, and ultimately getting to the indivisible particles. And for consciousness and mental processes, it was divided up from the grosser level of conscious experience that you can report down to going ever more subtle levels where you can divide up the duration, time, into eventually identifying an indivisible point of time. So you can see the sophistication of the thinking behind all of this. And compared to the other Abhidhamma school, Sotran Thika had a slightly different take on how the particles within an atom relate to each other. So they accepted they do not touch each other, but at the same time, they said there are no spaces in between them. So that was how they maintained. Now here, you can see that this is a Buddhist essentialist school, and although their approach is reductionist, one thing that I have to clarify to the Western scientists and scholars here is that when I talk of Buddhist reductionist school, none of the Buddhists ever can be characterized as a reductionist in the Western sense, where you reduce even the mental to the physical. No Buddhist schools ever did that. Other than that, Buddhists would have a reductionist process for the mental world and reductionist process for the physical world. But the mental is never reduced to the physical. So that's an important caveat that I need to make. But otherwise...
That's very important.
Yeah. So otherwise, the approach is reductionist. Now, early on, although this kind of theory, this way of looking at matter became very, very influential, quite widespread, but the critiques of this kind of approach emerged quite early. Nagarjuna was the founder of the Madhyamaka Middle Way School, 2nd century Common Era. Aryadeva was his immediate student, who was also a great philosopher and a thinker in his own right, in addition to being a famous student of Nagarjuna. Just for the sake of example, I wanted to give you a taste of what kind of critiques were leveled against this idea of this atomic theory. One argument, and all of these, most of these thinkers really didn't really bother that much with the specifics of the detailed theory of the aggregation of matter from the atoms and so on, but rather they all critiqued the final conclusion of arriving at the postulate of indivisible, ultimate, real entities. So here, one of the arguments is this. This is from the argument of incoherence, and basically they are arguing that the idea of indivisible, partless particle just doesn't make any sense. It's incoherent. Because if it is a particle, then it's a part of a matter, and matter presupposes some kind of spatial locus, although this morning Arthur said that you can have two things at the same spatial locus. Then the argument goes, and anything that occupies space entails, at least at the conceptual level, different spatial dimensions. And anything that has a spatial dimensions cannot be a simple indivisible element. So the idea is that if it is, in order for it to be conceived as matter, you have to include the idea of having some kind of locus. And if it has a locus, then it has a spatial dimension. And if it has a spatial dimension, then it will have different dimensions. So then that idea that it is an indivisible, simple element just doesn't make any sense. So that was one argument. The same argument is presented in 20 stanzas, which is the more famous one, which most people know. But Aryadeva is 2 centuries earlier, and there is exactly the same argument in Aryadeva's text. The second argument, yes, His Holiness was saying that the 20 stanzas exist also in Korean tradition as well. This is by Vasubandhu, who was a very influential Buddhist teacher of the 4th century of the Yogacara school. Aryadeva also comes up with another argument, which is to really kind of argument from the causal agency, because again he's arguing that if this idea of indivisible simple element in a particle makes sense, then you wouldn't be able to account for the aggregation because there is no causal agency that could be attributed to it. So the argument runs in the following way. If the alleged elemental particles are ultimate indivisibles with no dimensions, there would be no causal activity at all, which in turn would make it impossible for aggregation of particles to form material objects to take place. So one is from the causal point of view, the other one is from incoherence. So there are numerous other arguments like that, which are really critiquing the fundamental kind of standpoint of this reductionist approach. Now, the Madhyamaka that His Holiness referred to is an important school, and particularly for the Tibetan tradition, it is the most influential school. In fact, it reminds me of an ironic line from Kungtang Rinpoche, a 17th century a Tibetan author. He says, he's chiding his Tibetan colleagues. He says that in India, at least, the Buddhist thinkers were honest, that each held their own philosophical viewpoints according to their own kind of inclinations. Here in Tibet, all of us claim to be Madhyamaka Prasangikas, but how far our views are Prasangika is open to question. But in any case, so in any case, Madhyamaka is the most influential school.
I think it's a Tibetan case.
So His Holiness is saying that one of the key individuals that was instrumental in establishing Buddhist scholarship and Buddhist studies in Tibet was Shantarakshita, a great master from the Nalanda Monastery, who was himself a great Madhyamaka thinker as well as an authority on Buddhist epistemology. That's why the study of Madhyamaka and epistemology became so influential in Tibet. So, in fact, Padmasambhava was also a contemporary master of, together with Shantarakshita, who was also highly instrumental in ensuring the success of establishment of Buddhism in Tibet. But Padmasambhava's role seemed to be primarily in the domain of helping with the ceremonies and rituals and ensuring the successful establishment of Buddha Dharma. Whereas when it came to actual ordination, establishment of the ordination of the monastic order, giving classes and imparting the Buddhist knowledge and philosophy, it seems Shantarakshita played a very crucial role. So the Madhyamaka middle way school.
So Shantarakshita is at that time, 8th century, one of the best sort of thinkers or philosophers of Nalanda.
Nalanda, yes. So you heard that, yeah, okay. Shantarakshita was in the 8th century one of the greatest philosophers and thinkers of the Nalanda tradition, Nalanda Monastery. So, in fact, Shantarakshita was, so important that a whole new strand of Madhyamaka school, sub-school, emerged out of his thought, which is the Yogacara Madhyamaka school. So he was not just any philosopher or thinker, but he was in fact a founder of a sub-school of the Madhyamaka tradition. So to continue, Madhyamaka, as I said before, does not really take issues with the specifics of the atomic theory, but rather examine the fundamental premises underlying the entire project. And it argues that the Buddhist essentialist and the reductionist really project is an essentialist, objectivist, and reductionist project, which is searching for the final, simple, irreducible elements that would constitute the ultimate building blocks. And once you find that, and then you start building up like a structure, a cohesive picture of world. So that was one of the main, in some sense, diagnosis. Another thing that they pointed out is that often that kind of project goes hand in hand with the corollary in the epistemology domain, which is a foundationalist project where you seek your knowledge, seek to ground your knowledge to, again, some indubitable perception of real facts in the world. So you can see there's a sort of a Cartesian, similar to the Cartesian project. So just as you have in the ontology, there's a kind of a reductionist, an objectivist attempt. Similarly, in the epistemology, there's a foundationalist approach. And so together, it's an attempt to really, it's a project to look for an ultimate description of reality, a kind of a final description of reality. And so the Madhyamaka's critique to this entire project is really focused on questioning the key assumption underlying all of this, which is a belief in some kind of essence or intrinsic existence, by virtue of which things are thought to possess their existence as well as their identity. So things are, they have some kind of objective inherent existence, and it is this essence by virtue of which things are then thought to not only possess their existence, but also their identity as well as the kind of properties that they are supposed to have. So, for example, Nagarjuna's fundamental stanzas on the middle way, Mula Madhyamaka Karika, Tsawasharap, is in 27 chapters, and each chapter, takes many of the categories of both epistemology and primarily kind of metaphysics and ontology, like time, person, agency, action, and so on, and take them one after another and critique the underlying assumptions of some kind of intrinsic property and intrinsic reality. Now, then the question is, okay, so the Madhyamakas have basically pointed out that this project is not really that helpful. It is so fun, they critiqued it. Then the question is, what do they propose in place of this? It's not simply enough to simply critique it and then leave it there. So their proposal is really presented within the framework of the theory of the two truths. Now, theory of the two truths is universal in the Buddhist world, and to some extent, other non-Buddhist classical Indian tradition also use that kind of framework. But it is in Madhyamaka that the theory of two truths is really used. One could almost say that the reason why the theory of two truths was developed in classical India is to really kind of reflect the recognition very, very early on. There is a gap between the way we perceive things and the way things really exist. And to explain that disparity, this theory emerged. So therefore, His Holiness would like to share with the quantum specialists that if the quantum theorists take on board this framework of the two truths, then you will have easier time. Because because otherwise you run into a problem, because when you try to search for the reality, then all your conventions start getting wobbly and becomes very problematic. When you develop the conventions and try to develop a description, then you run into problem with actual reality. So, however, it is in Madhyamaka thought. Where is this coming from? Yeah. However, it is in the Madhyamaka thought that the theory, the full force and the potential of the theory of the true truth is really used to really, kind of get around this problem. Michel gave the example of Dogen and already referred to that term tathatha, thatness or suchness. So basically, what the Madhyamakas are arguing is that really it's not possible to develop any ultimate description of reality. That is final description. In particularly, basically, Madhyamakas are arguing that you cannot really have an ultimate, final, comprehensive description of reality that is really ultimately true, because all the categories of dichotomies really break down when you get to the ultimate level. Even causality breaks down at the ultimate level. So therefore, no, so the ultimate truth is beyond conceptual elaboration. So although one may be able to talk about it, but you can never really describe it exactly as it is. It is where all the verbal proliferations really come to an end. And this is the famous, the silence of the noble ones. And therefore, it is referred to as emptiness and thatness, and sometimes the end of reality or reality limit. So, on the other hand, the conventional or the relative truth, now it is there, we can then use all the conventions, all categories of cause and effect, subject and object, identity and difference, become meaningful on this conventional relative truth level. So now it is on this conventional level, now our descriptive system actually now is a constitutive part of reality. So to speak of reality independent of our description is essentially meaningless, because as His Holiness earlier pointed out, that many of the properties are really created by the human mind to make sense of our experience of the world. So these are attributes that we experience and we perceive, but actually they are constitutive part of the reality of the world that we live in, but they are created by ourselves. So it's a much more kind of sophisticated understanding of reality and our relation to it. So what is real is really, and what is not, is defined by their transactional efficacy, and His Holiness already gave the criteria that it should be something that is affirmed by the convention, consensual convention, and it should not be contradicted by another valid cognition. So it's the transactional efficacy is really, and in some sense, this is getting not that dissimilar to what you are talking about, this instrumental attitude to quantum theory. Now, within this descriptive system, because it is within the framework of conventional truth, there is no ultimately real, irreducible, simple, independent entities, because those kind of concepts only emerge as a result of looking for something that is final, that the real ultimate. So these kind of concepts have no place within that framework, and therefore everything is understood to be thoroughly contingent and complex. And this is where Nagarjuna's text particularly the fundamental stantos on the middle way, is a very powerful one, where Nagarjuna, not only in order to establish emptiness, uses huge amount of extensive reasoning, but also points out that you can take any concept. Any concept is thoroughly composite concept. It's a contingent concept. Generally we tend to think effects depend upon the cause, but not the other way around. But he would argue that the very concept of something as a cause already presupposes an understanding of its relation to effect. So if you go along those lines, there is not a single concept that is in some sense a discrete, simple concept. They're presupposed. And in some sense, this is not that, there's a little bit of similarity to what Wittgenstein talks about, kind of, the context that we already presupposes, the language, context. And then also, in the end, Nagarjuna, when it eventually talks about what is there, and he starts to describe what is there in the language of dependent origination. Pratitya samubhada, dependent arising or dependent origination. So in a sense, you cannot really disentangle the reality and even the identity of things, independent of, the other things that it is related to. So it's a sort of really quite similar to the quantum notion of entangled. It's a sort of a web of dependent origination. So therefore, not only with respect to their existence, but even very regard to their very identity of what they are, as they are utterly contingent and thoroughly relational. And this relational, and as in the case of modern physics, it's a very difficult concept to try to get handle on. In fact, in Chandrakirti's commentary on one of the chapters of Nagarjuna's text, even suggest that we can completely recast the language of objects in terms of language of relations. And he gives some examples of very relational terms that we use in our ordinary experience language, for example, like long and short, and driver and cook. These are all terms that are very relative and immediately indicate their relativity. So for example, the term president would be relative to a particular office, and term cook would be relative to a particular profession. So term driver would be relative to a particular action. So in the same way, Chandrakirti, in his interpretation of Nagarjuna, seems to be suggesting that actually we can recast the language of objects to a language of relation. And it's the relations that are, a more helpful way of looking at the world. To be honest, I myself find that suggestion very, very difficult to grasp, but I think there is something in there, but I can't at the same time imagine a whole new language being developed where we get rid of the object language, but also talk only in terms of relations. 이게 본바다 지지 상만을 자로 자세히 줘 갖다 이 자제 그것도 되는데 So in other words, what the Madhyamaka philosophers are saying is that reductionism as a method is not really an issue here, so long as it doesn't preclude the relationality of things. So one can still validly do this kind of reduction from the macroscopic to the smaller units and so on. But reductionism motivated by an essentialist quest for objective independent entities is really not helpful, and it's eventually is a doomed endeavor. And so within the framework of conventional truth, yes, our description can be fine-tuned, and one can also talk about correct versus incorrect descriptions, because the conventional truth and the framework is a framework within which laws of the logic would operate, laws of causality would operate. So there is a method by which we can adjudicate. It's not purely a subjectivistic view where we do not have any recourse to any kind of objective criteria of evaluation. But that criteria of evaluation really comes from the fact that it is contingent to a conventional framework which presupposes a consensually arrived at convention, and which includes the laws of logic and causality as well. And thus, the Buddhist emphasis on trying to understand causality as far as possible, even at the quantum level. Sorry. So I hope I have done some justice to the whole history of Buddhist thinking, and you can see that at the end of this, you can see basically a tension which is there historically. On the one hand, if reductionism as a method is valid, then you would want to expect, moving from the grosser level of everyday experience to a kind of a more minute level where we can eventually find something that is ultimate. But at the same time, if you end up postulating real, indivisible, ultimately real entities, then it opens up a whole host of questions about how do you understand their properties, how do you then understand the relational nature of all the things that they are, that are made from these supposedly indivisible particles. Sure.
Please. Could you use a mic?
And you mentioned in Tibetan tradition, or none of the Buddhist school is an attempt to reduce the mental to the physical. But in Tibetan Buddhist tradition, was there any an attempt to relate the mental to physical things? I mean, without reducing them fully, but to things like the brain. Was there any relationship thought to be between brain and brain stuff and the mental and mental stuff?
What?
Or body.
Body.
I mean, body in general, but brain in particular?
The brain is an interesting question because generally, despite all the great amount of energy expended on understanding mental processes and also theory of knowledge and so on in classical Indian tradition, interestingly, in the epistemological text, to my knowledge, I have not seen anywhere any awareness of the important role brain plays as a locus for human experience or thought. This said, interestingly, I have found in a Tibetan medical text, and particularly in the Vajrayana text, some awareness of the role brain plays in the arising of the experience of joy and suffering. So, which seems to suggest there was some recognition of the brain's role, but not in the epistemological tradition. But to respond to your question, one could argue, of course this is my own personal interpretation, in the highest yoga tantric tradition, there seems to be a suggestion. I'm saying suggestion because I'm not exactly sure, and I don't want to speculate too much in front of His Holiness, that there seems to be a suggestion that, the mental processes, even at the most minute and subtlest level, are in some ways inseparable from physical processes. But here, physical, of course, the conception of what constitutes physical has to be very different. And in the Buddhist language, Tibetan language, Buddhist language, we refer to it as wind, or an energy, or a wind. So every mental activity, or mental episode, or event is composed by two dimensions. One is the cognitive mental dimension. The other one is the mobility, moving dimension, which is the energy. And energy is the physical dimension at a subtle level. Energy is the physical level, physical dimension, and the mental is, that, of course, the experiential dimension. And no matter how subtle you get, even at the point of death, where the subtlest moment of consciousness is supposed to arise, even there, the two remains inseparable. Inseparable. So they are, in some sense, two sides of the same thing. So that view is there, but I haven't seen that in the philosophical texts.
Okay. Please. Yes.
as Sudhijima mentioned, in Tantriana, this is, I think some of you may know, there are a lot of different deities. So it seems somewhere the deities' world, their own king or prince or queens or like that. Actually, not that. All, you see, symbolic, right? About our body element. Body element. So one sort of the goddess Tara. Tara is the symbol of subtle energy. So subtle energy, as he mentioned, you see, the main sort of the ability is movement, or yuljuba.
So we explained the ability of the cognitive process, the cognitions, to be able to, to be directed. That ability is attributed to the wind dimension.
So you see that deity usually visualize here, head. So that symbolize head. Although you see no explanation about it, as you see those brain specialists, you see their knowledge is really vast.
Advanced, no? Advanced.
No. But the essence, you see, the mind knowing, movement come from here. So energy here. So I think indirectly, the Jew brain is the.
So indirectly, it seems there was a recognition of the role brain plays in the experience, at least.
다 시에바 미주버사디 다 이시 미주버스로 다 닝걸스가 다 과르시하고는 메신다디 다 공점이 내리들이야 상고 세트는 고민도잖아 즉 소용야지다 즉 강서순이 즉 영화 캔사는야지 용되도 왔다 배나 대화리야 또무 고민이 퇴폐야 지금 닝걸이 미고 때니 뒤르면 아주 용기도 왔다 저상고 될이야 비전은 셰브는 신그 자고디디 코봉어지 되니 요 말이지 그 뒤는 내가 지어서
So
the dealing of further research 하죠 또
So if you look at say for example, the contemplative practices that are described in the Vajrayana texts, which involve the kind
now
of
here I mainly mention Guhi Samaja.
In the Guha Samaja Tantra in particular, there are forms of practices that involve application of mind and also energy at different critical junctures of the body. And these are referred to as chakras or centers. And so as a result of engaging in these practices, for example, at the point of navel, engaging in the tumu meditation.
This is the source of heat.
And so there is a real experience, effect that is felt at that spot.
No.
So at the heart, it's associated with the water element, and as a result of engaging in practices that involve focusing on that chakra, one can also experience certain dissolutions of energy, and as a result, the effects can be felt on those sites. So, although it is early days, but I think it would be helpful down the line to be able to do some research and trying to, it's not the case that if we were to open our body that we will find these physical kind of, chakras, but at least, as a result of practice, we can see effects felt on those specific points. So there must be something which perhaps could be a fruitful field of research.
So these things, the physical, the joy of this.
So all of this is to say that there is a recognition of how intimate the connection is between body and mind.
Richie, do you use it yet?
No, not this one.
Which one was working?
This one.
Just try it. No.
Can you put the handheld? Yeah.
No.
Your Holiness, you were referring to subtle energy but some of the effects of the subtle energy are clearly manifest. They are apparent to the practitioner, and they, in certain cases, have actually been measured. And I just wonder if you can say a little bit more about how the distinction between subtle and coarse is actually made. How do we know that a particular energy is subtle? What is the definition of subtle? And is there a continuum between subtle and coarse, or is it something that is more...
subtle.
No. Tanadi taragi yemje kanangi orba. That kanda long time nam gyuti komja beton tongu yote restaine. Ne tamo yema yengi. Chamo kanda chika ton shagyo na. Ane tamo da rabani buti gyum manya bache dusya the yore. Rabe chamji gane ane lamsang tongje shaje ane tamo kya.
So both consciousness, I really don't know the exact sort of terminology, I don't know. The consciousness and energy always go together. So now here, very grosser level, and more subtle, and very, very subtle. I think at least we can say it's 4 levels. On grosser level, during all the senses of organs active, that's gross level. Now, dream state, a little subtler. Then deep sleep, furthermore, subtler. Then deepest or innermost subtle level is actually brain function stop. Clinically dead. I think we discussed something, which usually call tuktam. The body element now completely ceased. Still, the body remains fresh. 2 weeks, 3 weeks, sometimes 4 weeks. So there's no other way to explain except the subtle mind still in that body. So where there's subtle mind, here or here, we don't know. But training for that, sort of visualization is usually concentrated here. Grosser level, dissolve, step by step. Then finally, the subtle mind. So the deepest mind, no related with, not depend on brain. Like that. But I have no experience. So one time, I think in early, I think early 70, one letter my office received from Bombay. So I think some NGO, some organization, they asked, this is among Tibetan practitioners, some sort of mysterious experiences supposed there. So they want to experiment or investigate. So then my staff member asked me how to reply. Then ya mariselo tomorrow ya. Ya some zuzu amiduwa. So you are the kiguris leching.
So His Holiness' staff was asking him how to respond. So His Holiness said, since we cannot say that such things do not exist, but at the same time there were no any specific individuals which we could cite as an example. So His Holiness suggested that to write them saying that such a person hasn't been born yet.
Now 30, 40 years passed. So I think that same organization asked me, now sufficient time, 40 years passed, 30, 40 years passed. So I think there must be just someone at least. So, 롬니 개별 타마르디 라 롬니 개별 두든디 선 요시테고 근데 뭐 딱 왔을 때 아다 가데 파라 삼거데 부디 소스다디 만주 탐메베 시번디 림베 소남치 저람치 통남 고놈치 사주 라모스 파 즉 sabta 대회서 멤버 소수 규 니가리야다 규 가서 그렇게 내서로 셔도로 심을 타네 애는 라모한테 샤워야 저기 자 드리고 더 공에 인심이 주고기 nen다 기규에서 넘어가신 거로 시안데 다들 기규에서 기르네
So, Solms was saying that, here there is a large monastic gathering, and, I've often told them that ultimately the purpose of the classical Buddhist education is to really bring about transformation within oneself. And
So one thing I think, one unique thing about Buddhist practice, particularly in Nalanda tradition, is utilize human intelligence maximum way, through that way transform our emotion. So that's why you see these sophisticated sort of philosophy is mentioned involved.
So Solins was saying that he often points out to his fellow monastics that we should pay attention to what comes at the end of Heart Sutra, when it says gate gate para samgate bodhisattva, go beyond and establish the basis for enlightenment, and which really suggests the progression of the path towards enlightenment. And it is important for the monastic members to remember that when we talk about path to enlightenment, we should not have a sense of looking at a map outside, talking about some objective place out there for someone else, but rather that map should be turned within and try to bring about those progressive stages of transformation within oneself. And this is the way that one can genuinely make these things a reality.
Thank you. Are there any other comments that people would like to make, including from around the table, in the last few moments that we have before we need to break?
Your Holiness, I have a question or two. You talked about this self-transformation through the application of contemplative practices. Do you believe that whether it's Madhyamaka philosophy or whether it's quantum physics, they are challenging, very challenging philosophical demands? And we don't naturally think in this way. We think in the common thoughts and patterns of our lives. Will we at some point become so fluent and easy with these concepts as we are with the common? In other words, can we develop an understanding of quantum mechanics? Can Richard Feynman's claim be wrong?
단다 군주네 로녀서 간다 타르투 운데갈다 수수 로 장지 양용 책을 가능 봐봐. 대단데 왜 돈에 단데 맞지 우메 따와다 콘좀 그돈에 셰빌걸 셰버 띵사고 싶지. 맞지 로레 차라가고 된데 지금 연구하러 왔어. 대두주디 림베로 콤제 ben ume shune shebe tawe namsha de ge de namshi chili yang ran jo sam kyuma tang ba na shin gi chik lubu yong ya ga tabshe yonas ta quantum sne da ya ume
I think that's the question. According to my own little experience, I start serious thinking about, the according to Buddhist Madhyamaka philosophy, the relative theory. Since it is relative, therefore no absolute. So absence of independent existence or absence of absolute.
Okay.
So that subject, since my childhood, I think almost 15, 16 years old, I already sort of developed some interest.
Yes.
Then, actually, my daily practice is to analyze the reality, myself, my mind, or everything. That's one of the most important part of my daily practice. So now familiarize. Now last over 50 years. See that firstly intellectual level, then gradually actually sort of feeling. Now see that the 정신에 봐서야 이 한도 로리야 직도저 자연주의나다. 이 자연 두 스텝이나 패즈 규모도서 지tum이 잘.
So as a result of this kind of prolonged familiarization and reflection on a day-to-day basis, so His Holiness was saying that when I, consciously bring up the notion of absence of intrinsic existence or emptiness, that immediately is able to kind of create a flavor so that his perception of the world becomes almost has this illusion-like quality.
So that the very purpose of that understanding is reduce the extreme view of sort of attachment and hatred, anger. All is very much based on mental projection. So mental exaggeration on the basis of appearance of independent existence. So once you really develop full conviction, no independent existence, then reduce the basis of exaggeration, right, mental projection. So that's the way to reduce destructive emotion. Destructive emotion based on ignorance. Constructive emotion based on logic. So that makes differences. So, but that's my secret. I do not want to share with scientists.
Well, I must say you're doing a very bad job of not sharing it with the scientists.
Your Holiness, it seems...
Actually, I always emphasize, we Buddhists, you see, we discuss these things, but we never intend to promote Buddha Dharma. I respect different religious tradition, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Zoroastrian, different Hinduism, Jainism. It worked. Last 1,000 years, to millions of people in the past, not only in the past, at present, and future also. So from sometimes we a little bit sort of critical about some Christian missionary sort of worker.
Okay.
So our own sort of view, some of these sort of religious people actually making attempt to conversion. So first, in order to criticize, critical view about them, you yourself must sort of follow, respect their religion. You should not make an attempt at conversion. So we must, in the philosophical field, there's big differences among these different religions. Obviously, God, Creator. In the Buddhist theory, no room that. So sometimes, one time, my American friend, a Catholic monk, really very nice person. He found, some of the Buddhist practice regarding practice of tolerance, practice of compassion, these things, and also practice of, certain method of single-pointed mind. So we always happy share some of our experience, some of our sort of method. One day he asked me about the emptiness. Then I told him, no, this is not your business. This is Buddhist business. Because you see, that theory not fit the concept of absolute center sort of creator. So I do not want to create some kind of sort of questions, their own sort of basic faith. So it is better to keep individual business like that.
Your Holiness, this absence of intrinsic existence that we talk about, these properties that common to Madhyamaka philosophy, and now also I think personally one sees these in physics. There are similar critiques of the essentialist view. I wonder if it doesn't have ethical implications, as you spoke about, that we no longer are basing our knowledge on a kind of ignorance or mistake, but it then has also consequences for other people. We're not grasping any longer. Is there an ethical dimension to this that could be a part? Frankly, I'm thinking of your secular ethics, that there's a way in which the science can actually help lay a foundation for a secular ethical orientation. Is there an ethics?
안 되도록 이게 저희 밴디 패진 찬스 다시샤 요토 즉 퀀텀 피직스 다가식 knowledge고 매베체 그직도 feeling이 되는 지기 배는 미지기 차당 유기에 그도를 the reaction condition도 response 근데 퀀텀 피직스 계시티 미싱이 지기 그게 absolutely something 되게 차당 유체에 그도를 response condition도 패지 다시샤요.
So maybe there could be an experimental opportunity here. For example, if you can find individuals who are not only intellectually kind of conversant in the quantum physics theory and its implication, but also has an emotional connection and genuinely feel convinced by
some kind of firm conviction out of reasoning, out of research, firm conviction. No independent existence.
Intrinsic
extinct.
Intrinsic existence.
Oh, that one. I don't know that word.
So, and you can compare that person's attitude to others in ethically challenging situations versus someone who has this more absolutist view and grasp onto things based on that absolutist views. Maybe one could
see a difference.
Check.
I think naturally,
Yes.
you see those people, more experienced people, who really passing through a lot of sort of difficult sort of life or experiences. Then someone who never faced such difficulties, then when you see passing through some difficult situation, the person who lot of experience, their mind, their response to that sort of tragedy, much more calm.
Yeah.
The other one, too much sort of excitement, too much of the frustration of these things. So similarly, you see, these sort of wisdom helping something like regulation about our emotion. So that's the way.
You speak.
So then these scientists, I will
celebrate. Then I will celebrate you, scientists.
Oh, those scientists as a guru, great guru. Perhaps shaman dramatic kawya visa. In the science gurus or shaman mixation is.
And given that the Tibetans are so fond of hats of all sorts of shapes and kind, we could actually make a special hat for the science gurus.
Science guru.
I think, Your Holiness, has to be a very big hat.
Magic test out Korea. Shamu she. 이국 샤 여대지게.
이국.
저서 안 되지 마지 샤 있는 자네 배 10사고 she. 야 그래서는 이국도 또.
So maybe Solons was saying, maybe for the quantum physicist, you can have a huge hat, but with lots of holes. Because when you make the presentation, it all looks so wonderful. Then when you look at the implication, it's full of holes.
Sorry.
Hat, not hat. Thank you very much. I think we should close on that wonderful note.